Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I'm going to start with a rather depressing image. It illustrates one example of 0 degrees of empathy. So this is an image of 2 scientists working in the Nazi concentration camp, Dachau. And they were performing an experiment on one of the inmates in the concentration camp. They called it the freezing water immersion experiment. And these 2 scientists were interested to see how long a human being could survive in freezing water. And like good scientists, they took measurements, and they measured the person's physiology and obviously duration until they died. Now, the thing that strikes, I'm sure, all of us is how was this possible? How is it possible that human beings could treat another person with no empathy, purely in the pursuit of their own interests in science? The fact that these were educated people makes it all the harder to understand. It's not the only example of human cruelty, and actually we only have to open any newspaper or turn on the news any day of the week to hear examples of human cruelty, but it raises the same question about how we understand human cruelty. Well, the old theory to explain human cruelty is to talk about evil, that people do awful things to each other because they are evil. As a scientist, I find this not very useful as a term. I don't think it helps us understand what's going on. It's not just not explanatory, but it's dangerously circular. Because if we take the word evil just to mean the absence of good, then effectively all we're saying is he did something bad because he is bad. It doesn't really take us any further, and if anything, it just takes us back to where we started. The alternative that I'm proposing is that we should explain human cruelty in terms of the erosion of empathy. So, what is empathy? Well, there are lots of definitions of empathy. My definition recognizes 2 components. The first is the cognitive part. That's the recognition or the understanding part. And I've defined that as the drive to identify what another person might be thinking or feeling. So it's all about putting yourself into someone else's shoes, to take their perspective and to imagine what's going on in their mind. The second component is what psychologists call affective, which is another word for emotional. It's the emotional reaction to somebody else's thoughts and feelings. And you can see my definition there as the drive to respond with an appropriate emotion to someone else's thoughts and feelings. And I'm going to argue that you need both components to talk about somebody having empathy, that if you had one without the other, arguably that wouldn't be empathy at all. The psychopath might be able to do the first part. They might be able to recognize that their victim is in pain, but not have the appropriate emotional response of wanting to alleviate another person's distress. So arguably, the psychopath does not have empathy. The other new idea that I want to introduce at the outset is the idea of empathy being on a spectrum. Here's the familiar bell curve that we see time and time again in nature when we look at individual differences that differs in the population. Most of us are going to be somewhere in the middle, but you can see that there'll be a minority of people who have very high empathy, and again, a minority who have very low empathy. And what I want to look at is what are the different routes that we can end up at this extreme left-hand tail of the distribution. Well, here's a way to measure empathy, because I've just shown you a sort of idealized model, that bell curve. This was a questionnaire called the Empathy Quotient, which attempts to try to identify where people lie on that empathy spectrum. How this works is that you read each statement, and you say whether you agree or disagree with each statement as a description of you. There are lots of these questions, And what you can see is, sure enough, it does produce that nice bell curve. So now we're looking at real data from thousands of people who've used the questionnaire in the population. As we expected, most people are in the middle. So we've got average empathy, but there are people down at this low end. You can also see, just as an index of individual differences, that if we just cut the population in terms of gender, males and females, that females are scoring slightly but statistically significantly higher than males on this measure of empathy. Here's another way that you can measure empathy, which is what we call a performance test, how good you are at recognizing what someone else might be thinking or feeling. So you look at the photograph of someone's face, in this case just the eye region of the face, and you're asked to pick which of these 4 words best describes what she's thinking or feeling. This is just one example from the test, and the correct answer here is that she's dispirited, a little bit sad. So we're well aware that we all make a lot of eye contact. We tend to look at people's faces, particularly look at their eyes. We're not necessarily consciously aware of why we're doing it, but this sort of experiment is telling us that actually there's a lot of rich information around the eyes as a cue to what someone else might be thinking or feeling. And what you can see just at the bottom of that slide is again that women, on average, are scoring slightly but significantly higher than men on this test of empathy. But back to the whole question of cruelty, the philosopher Martin Buber was also very interested in this question, and he identified that the point at which you start treating a person as an object is when you become capable of cruelty. And he distinguished 2 different ways that you can relate to a person. You can either relate to them as a person, what he called I-you relationships, where you recognize the person's subjectivity, or you can treat a person as an object, no different to this piece of furniture, what he calls I-it relationships. And the moment that you shift from one mode to the other is the point when your empathy has been switched off. I work in a department of psychiatry in the university, and so one perspective into how people can end up with low empathy is to look at specific psychiatric conditions. We've already mentioned psychopaths, but I'm going to be showing you 3 different personality disorders which can, I think, involve low empathy. And I call these zero negative because people can end up with literally 0 degrees of empathy. And it's negative in the sense that it's not good for the person, and nor is it good for people all around that person. So these are the 3 personality disorders. The top one is borderline personality disorder. People with this condition have very unstable relationships and extreme mood swings. They tend to switch from one moment expressing affection to, within seconds, expressing anger. And they can lash out on people that are close to them, either physically or emotionally close to them. They often also threaten suicide with no intention of carrying it out, but also with no real consideration of the impact that such a threat has on the other person. The second personality disorder is psychopathic personality disorder. It's also sometimes known as antisocial personality disorder. And these are individuals, I think, also have low empathy, but in a different way. So they're diagnosed on the basis of being superficially very charming. They lull you into trusting them, but it soon turns out that almost everything they say is a lie. They'll use deception to get what they want. The last one, less well known, narcissistic personality disorder. You can see an image here of the Greek mythological figure Narcissus, who was only in love with himself and his own reflection. It really just describes individuals who are self-preoccupied, who don't really think about others all around them. So I think that although these are personality disorders, in the sense that they are enduring personality characteristics, another way to conceptualize these is in terms of low empathy. But what's led to this outcome? John Bowlby, who worked at the Tavistock Clinic up in Swiss Cottage here in London, he argued that early experience plays a major role. So he studied delinquents. So he was looking at teenagers who'd got in trouble with the law, and he was able to trace back that a lot of their antisocial behavior was because they had been brought up in children's homes, in institutions where they didn't have the opportunity to form caring relationships with a parent figure, but instead they had multiple caregivers. Many of them had had as many as 50 by the time he interviewed them. So he argued that attachment is key in the formation of empathy. These are individuals who, by their teens, were quite willing to do what it takes to get what they want, but also had great difficulty in getting close to other people and trusting other people, forming stable emotional relationships. So he argued that insecure attachment in childhood, either through neglect or even worse, through abuse, could lead to this outcome of delinquency. But that can't be the whole story, because here we see another study from London, the Institute of Psychiatry down in Camberwell, by Avshalom Caspi, who looked at a particular gene. So this is a gene that we all carry, but there are several versions of this gene. It's called the MAOA gene, and you can see the two variants in red and blue here. But he looked at the likelihood of developing conduct disorder or delinquency in your teens, depending on whether you had one version of the gene or the other, and also as a function of whether you'd experienced maltreatment. And what you can see is that the worst combination is in individuals who've experienced severe childhood maltreatment, but also carry this particular version of the gene. So this is suggesting that environment is important, but it interacts with your genetic makeup. Back to that questionnaire that we used earlier, the Empathy Quotient. When people filled it out, we also asked them to give us a bit of their DNA. And we looked at a whole bunch of genes, but these ones here showed a significant statistical association with the scores on the Empathy Quotient. A couple of these genes are involved in hormones, particularly testosterone. And we thought that was interesting, given the sex difference that we came across earlier, that women seem to have better empathy than men, given that men have more testosterone than women. So we've been looking at testosterone produced by the fetus to see whether the hormones that the baby's producing in the womb might have any effect on how the brain develops, and indeed postnatally, whether it's got any link to how much empathy the child shows. The way we do this is by asking women who are having amniocentesis during pregnancy, where a needle is introduced into that fluid that surrounds the baby. We're asking to analyze that fluid for how much testosterone is in the fluid. And then we wait for the baby to be born and test the child later on for their empathy level. So what you can see here is that these same children whose hormones were measured during pregnancy are now 8 years old. They're taking the child version of that empathy test. Here, the correct answer is that he's interested in something. And what we see in the graph down below is that there is a negative correlation with the amount of hormone that the child was producing in the womb. So the higher the child's testosterone prenatally, the more difficulty they're having reading faces to decode someone's facial expressions 8 years later. So although early experience is important, so are genes, and as it looks now, so are early hormones. The earliest sort of case study from neurology that gave us the big clue as to where empathy resides was from this man called Phineas Gage, who was working on the railroad track in the 1840s in the States. And his job was to use a metal pole to push the dynamite down before they laid the railway track. And one day the dynamite went off a bit too early and blew that pole right up underneath his eye and through his brain. A horrific accident, but the reason it made medical history in neurology was that he didn't die. Indeed, he lived for another 12 years. They removed the pole. But what was striking was that his intelligence, his reasoning, didn't seem to be affected by this brain damage, nor was his memory or his language. Indeed, much of his psychological functioning was as it was before, except that his empathy seemed to be affected. that prior to the accident, he was described as a very courteous, polite individual. After the accident, he was described as very impulsive, very rude, unable to judge what was socially appropriate. More than 100 years later, the neuroscientist Hannah Damasio was able to obtain Phineas Gage's brain, which had been preserved in a vat, and put it into a modern MRI scanner to see exactly where the location of the damage was. And she inferred that it was in this left ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So if anyone asks you, where is empathy in the brain? It's in the left ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Well, that seems to be well confirmed by modern neuroscience. But what you can see here is that actually that's not the only region involved in empathy. By my count, there are at least 10 different parts of the brain. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is up there. It's been well confirmed by other studies, but so are many others, other regions, and that they're all highly connected so that we can talk about an empathy circuit, that when we empathize with another person, this network of regions are activated. And when individuals who have personality disorders or very low empathy have brain scans, we can also see that different parts of this network, this empathy circuit in the brain, are underactive or haven't developed in the usual way. I'm going to ask a sort of almost unthinkable question now, which is whether 0 degrees of empathy is necessarily always bad. There's at least one condition in psychiatry where individuals struggle with empathy, but it doesn't necessarily lead to acts of cruelty, and that is people on the autistic spectrum. So here we can see people with autism and the related condition of Asperger's syndrome. They have difficulties in social relationships and communication, and they too struggle to empathize. Their low empathy tends to lead them to avoid other people because they find people confusing, to withdraw from the social world rather than to commit acts of cruelty. So this is telling us that low empathy may be part of what happens when someone commits a cruel act, but it's not a symmetric relationship, that if you have low empathy, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to commit a cruel act. People with autism process information very differently to other people. In particular, they've got strengths in certain ways of seeing the world. They tend to notice small patterns, small details that other people miss. And the reason that I call them zero positive is that alongside their difficulties with empathy, their unusual attention to detail often leads them to giftedness. I'm going to finish just by talking a little bit about empathy outside of the human species, because having identified that genes play a role in empathy, it raises this idea that empathy may be the result of evolution, and that those genes may have been selected, positively selected, during evolution. The only experiment that I've come across which has tried to systematically test empathy in monkeys was by Jules Masserman at Northwestern University in the 1960s. And what Masserman did was train these rhesus monkeys to pull a chain every time they wanted food. And the monkeys soon learnt that if they did that, they got the reward. And then Masserman changed the contingencies so that when they pulled the chain, yes, they got the reward, but they also saw another monkey getting an electric shock. And what Masserman observed was that the monkeys soon stopped pulling the chain as soon as they learnt that in getting a reward for themselves, it was also causing pain to another member of their species. So this certainly suggests that simpler forms of empathy may predate human beings, which should come as no surprise. But obviously in the human case, we see empathy blossoming into a much more flexible and complex ability. Empathy is a very valuable resource for humanity. I'm going as far as to say it's the most valuable human resource. And my reason for arguing that is that empathy has the power to resolve conflict. That when we have conflict, either between two individuals in a domestic situation, but even we could extend it to two nations. Empathy can allow each party to take the other person's perspective or the other leader's perspective and to understand their point of view. And that as a resource, it may be much cheaper, but also ultimately more successful strategy for conflict resolution than either military strategies or legal ones.
Is your theory primarily a theory about pathology, or is it a theory about empathy across society as a whole? Because it seems to me that these are two very different types of phenomena.
They may or may not be. So it's a theory about all of us. And so I don't draw a hard and fast line between pathology and the rest of the population. And that was inherent in that bell curve I showed you, that it's a seamless bell curve. It's not that at one point there's a discontinuous, a point where you could separate those who've got an illness or a psychiatric condition from the rest of us. So in that respect, it's a theory about all of us.
And when we think about empathy in all of us, one of the double-sided issues of empathy, of course, you talked about selection. We're not hardwired to show strangers the same empathy as we show family members, and indeed conflict sometimes arises, therefore, as a consequence of empathy for those around us, which is then expressed as hostility towards those who are deemed to be threatening them.
Yeah, and some people have talked about this in terms of in-group, out-group relations as well. So it could be that the in-group is your kin, because you share genes with them, or it could just be that it's your local culture, and that people who don't share your culture are the out-group. And it's certainly true that we find it easier to empathize with those who are nearer to us, whether they're nearer genetically or culturally. And that may also have some important lessons for social causes to low empathy. And I tried to argue that the way that you can lose your empathy is through many different routes. Could be a genetic route, could be early experience, but it could also be these cultural routes of how we define ourselves in relation to other groups.
And isn't that then the issue, the problem with focusing on empathy, or the importance of empathy, is that for most of people on this bell curve, we can go to incredible extremes in terms of our behavior as a consequence of those cultural factors. You're not, for example, suggesting that everybody in 1930s Germany had a deficit of empathy, or that everybody involved in the Rwandan massacres had a deficit of empathy. They were more towards the middle of your bell curve, but nevertheless they acted in ways which would be associated with a profound lack of empathy.
It may be that where you start on that bell curve, that cultural factors could push you in one direction or another. Hopefully it could push you up the empathy scale just as much as it could push you down the empathy scale. But we're all aware of how our empathy can fluctuate. It can fluctuate in different situations where we can find it easier to empathize at one time than at another. Maybe because of our current state, if we're feeling stressed or threatened or tired, we might find it hard to keep in mind somebody else's state of mind. But if we're equally being bombarded by propaganda telling us that this particular minority in the population is the enemy, that could also affect our empathy.
Isn't the danger that if one thinks about empathy as this, which has this kind of organic quality to it, genetic quality to it, that by talking about empathy, which is something, as it were, which is something which we feel, as against a metacognitive process in which we come to treat other people with empathy regardless of whether we feel empathy for them, for example, as we respect human rights. So is the path of enlightenment one which, as it were, seeks through a variety of therapeutic or pharmacological changes to make us more inclined to a wider world of empathy? Or is it simply to accept that as human beings we have a certain amount of empathy, more disposed to show it towards people that we like, and in a sense we have to use other cultural regulators to ensure that we behave empathically on a global scale?
It's a really interesting question, but you started off by saying empathy is primarily emotional. My definition was that actually empathy is a sort of umbrella concept with several different components, and I identified an emotional component, but also this cognitive one, what you called the metacognitive one. But there may be more than two components. I don't think of this in a reductionist way as being purely biological. It's a psychological process with lots of components. But in that way, it's no different to other psychological processes like language or like memory, which again have many components to them, and which may be partly biological, but as we've seen, are partly influenced by your culture, your surroundings. And just like language, how we end up speaking is going to be strongly influenced by our society. So our empathy is.
One of my favourite episodes of Star Trek is where Captain Kirk gets divided into two Kirks. And there's one who's incredibly decisive, and I think they're fighting the Klingons or something, but he also goes around assaulting the female staff. And there's another Kirk who's incredibly gentle and empathic and utterly useless, incapable of making decisions. Is there any sense in which, within the bell curve, that a slight lack of empathy does enable you to be a more decisive, more dynamic, more risk-taking, we talk a lot about entrepreneurialism, for example, a more entrepreneurial person, perhaps?
Yeah, and we talked about low empathy as 0 degrees of empathy as being bad for the individual. But if you were on the low side but not right at 0, that might allow you to negotiate the social world quite successfully, but also make these quite ruthless decisions for your own self-advantage. So, some people have speculated about whether to be a political leader, it helps if you've got slightly low empathy. And, I think...
Whilst pretending to have more empathy.
But, to qualify that, political leaders haven't been studied scientifically, so we don't know if it's true.